My family moved a lot. Now I know what we were running from. At first, I thought it was fun. We lived in an RV. It was like an endless vacation. One week, we were in LA. The next, we were in Salt Lake City. We didn't know much about our lives before this. We knew we were born in Portland and that we could never stop moving. We always knew we were a special family. I just guess we didn't know how special we were. My parents tried so hard to have kids and almost lost hope. That's why my twin sister and I were so special to them. Their little miracles. It was annoying, but at least we knew we meant something to them. Amelia and I were fairly close as far as siblings go. We were kind of each other's only friends since we were homeschooled. We felt pretty isolated. We never set up camp anywhere fun, no koi campgrounds with ice cream shops and swimming pools, always driving off-road and living deep in the woods. I guess it was peaceful in a way, but anyone who grew up near the woods understands it's not something you mess with. The first time I really personally realized something was up was just before our 7th birthday, when we were staying in a place in BC called Kamloops. We weren't supposed to sneak out or leave Mom and Dad's sight, but at the time we were mischievous 6-year-olds with a huge, unexplored forest in front of us. What do you expect? We waited until they fell asleep for the night and snuck out of the RV through the window, which was easy, because the window was just a sheet of plastic held together by a zipper. We set off with nothing but a shitty lantern to illuminate the path in front of us. It wasn't long before we saw something strange aglow. Not from our lantern. It was coming from in front of us. It didn't take long for us to see who or what was in front of us. It was a lady holding a small, homemade torch. But she didn't look much like a lady. Her hair was matted and fallen out in some places. Her skin was almost blue and looked rotted. Her teeth were yellow, and a few were missing, and I thought you could even see part of her jaw. She was wearing a dirty hospital gown. I didn't know where the nearest hospital was, but it had to be pretty damn far, because the last time I remember driving anywhere with a paved road had to be 3 hours before we set up camp here. Amelia and I were frozen in fear, and for the first time since we had mutually decided affection towards siblings was lame. I reached for her hand. That thing reached out its bony arm to us. It moaned something almost indecipherable, like moo-poo-poo-apa. That was enough to snap me out of it, and I sprinted away, dragging Amelia behind me. By some miracle, we had made it back to the RV, and by some other miracle, got back in without waking our parents. We didn't get much sleep, and were far too shaken up to even say good morning to our parents, let alone tell them what happened. Would they have even believed us if we told them? Well, after what happened next, I guess they would have to. When we opened the door to the RV, we saw that the remains of what we had left out overnight, a campfire reduced to ashes, the sticks covered in charcoal Amelia and I had used to draw on the rocks, and a makeshift table with a few cans of beans had been utterly destroyed. It wasn't too out of the ordinary to have our camp ravaged by animals. We lived in the woods, after all. But this was something no animal could do. This looked set up, like whatever did it had a plan. What we saw written on the back of the RV confirmed this belief. In the charcoal sticks, someone had written, "You can't run forever on our trailer." Mom made us breakfast while Dad cleaned up the mess. We left shortly after that and drove for hours, not even stopping for quick washroom breaks. Mom and Dad spoke in hushed whispers as Dad drove. I wish I knew what they had been talking about. That night, I guess because Mom and Dad could see we were shaken up, they took us for a rare treat. A dinner at a real restaurant. A shitty diner, but a restaurant nonetheless. It was empty there, which was why my parents liked it, as they hated crowds. I was over the moon. A root beer float and a greasy cheeseburger were everything a 6-year-old boy could dream of, which was why I was so upset when Mom and Dad made us leave the second someone else came in. It was just an old trucker. I didn't get the big deal. While we were in the RV, Amelia asked why we had to leave while I sulked in my bunk, a glorified shelf. Mom sighed. I suppose you two are almost 7. That's old enough to know. Well, Zachary, Amelia, the reason we had to leave is because we're scared of losing you. Do you remember what happened when you were 4? I had no idea. My memory was never good. But Amelia claimed to remember. We were in Beaverton, not too far from Portland. She said that when we were 4, we were running around in a field when a big man in camouflage and big boots came up to us and bent down to our level. We're not supposed to talk to strangers, Amelia said. She was always a goody two-shoes. I'm John. Now we're not strangers. What your names? I'm Zach and that's my sister Amelia. We're 4 and our birthday is July 26th. 2002, I had apparently said, but I bet Amelia just said I said that to make me look worse. That's when he stopped smiling. He roughly took our hands and started to lead us away. Let's go somewhere fun, Zach and Amelia. I need to take you someplace else. My mom got teary. That's right. If your dad and I hadn't caught you just before you left, we probably would have never seen you again. I took you to someplace safe. And your dad? Well, your dad, I shot that son of a bitch. In the leg. Hope he had fun crawling back to his house, he said coldly. Amelia and I shot each other glances. Okay, Daddy. I'm going to go to sleep now, she said, climbing over me to get to her bunk. That night, we stopped somewhere for the night. I forgot where, probably near the interior of BC or maybe Alberta. I looked out the little plastic window, and I saw her. I saw that fucking lady again. She was staring at me and Amelia in our bunk beds, reaching out for us with that same long, bony hand. I rolled over and tried to sleep but couldn't, knowing she was there. Life continued on like that for a while. Anywhere we'd stop, she'd be there. Washington? There she was. Nevada? You bet your ass. Montana? Better fucking believe it. Amelia and I didn't really explore much anymore. Partially because we were getting older and gradually showing less interest in that sort of thing. But partially because that experience in Kamloops traumatized us both. That didn't stop the lady from trying to get us. Sometimes we'd catch a glimpse of her on the highway as we drove by. Sometimes she'd appear right where the fire of our campsite stopped illuminating, so we could barely see her. On the rare occasion we went into public to get supplies or food, I could have sworn I caught a glimpse of her in the crowd. Whenever she was around, I always heard that damn cry of hers. Moo-hoo-poo-poo. After a while, she stopped scaring me. Well, as much. Everything finally made sense the day before Amelia and I turned 14. Mom and Dad had left the RV and gave us a rare couple of hours of freedom as they gathered things for our birthday. We weren't parked ridiculously far from civilization, but I'd say a good hour's worth of walking. We weren't that scared. We had lived in the woods long enough to know as long as you didn't bother the forest, it wouldn't bother you. And the lady in the hospital gown was honestly more of an annoyance than anything else. I'd even go so far as to say we had almost forgotten about her. I was reading, and Amelia was rummaging around the RV for food. I was getting immersed in my book when Amelia shouted out, "Zach, come check this out." I rolled my eyes. What could it be? We had lived in this tiny RV for almost 14 years. I knew it like the back of my hand. There was absolutely no nook or cranny I didn't know about. Oh, I guess I was wrong. There, under the driver's seat cushion Amelia had pulled out for some reason, was a box. It was small and a bit squished from all the years of my dad's ass sitting on it, but we could still tell what it was. Amelia excitedly reached to open it. Inside were papers. Forget about it, Amelia. It's probably just boring documents for work, I said. But the look of confusion to horror on my sister's face was enough to change my mind. They were documents, but not for work. Birth documents. For us. But the stated parents weren't ours. I was apparently Zachary Jr., but nobody in my family was named Zachary. I looked at the father's name, Zachary. The mother was someone named Emily. Maybe we were adopted, I suggested. Amelia reached in and pulled out another sheet of paper. She shook her head and held out the next one for me with a shaky hand. Infants missing from Portland Hospital, July 27, 2002. Twins, Zachary Christopher Clark Jr. and Amelia Emily Clark. Ongoing search. Anyone with information is to report it to the police immediately. Clark? Christopher? Those weren't our names. Our last name was Brown. And our parents certainly weren't Zachary and Emily. They were Jenny and Kevin. I had a feeling things were going to get worse. I was right, as Amelia pulled out the third and second to last paper. Portland mother of 2 murdered in hospital. Emily Clark, 27, had recently given birth to twins, now missing, when she was smothered to death in her own hospital bed. Police drawing of suspects. We looked at the police drawing. It was obviously not a complete match, but they were basically the only other 2 faces we had seen our entire lives. Mom and Dad. CCTV footage shows the 2 suspects leaving the hospital through a back door with the 2 infants. Search is ongoing. If spotted, do not approach these individuals. Alert the authorities immediately. We were silent as Amelia shakily grabbed the last piece of paper. This was from 2006. We were 4. After an Oregon man allegedly spotted the missing kids and was attacked by the perpetrators, a glimpse of hope is seen in this 4-year-long cold case. Father and husband of the victims, Zachary Clark shares this message. To my babies, I have no idea where you two are, but I will never let go of hope that one day I will see your beautiful faces again. You may not even know who I am, but that doesn't change anything. Until we meet again, Daddy loves you. We couldn't even say anything. What do you even say to that? We just stood in silence for a while. Then we heard a banging on the RV. We jumped and looked outside. It was the lady in the hospital gown, closer than ever. We could see her bluish gray skin. We could see her hazel eyes. They kind of looked like Amelia's. She moaned, reaching out for us again. I looked down to the newspaper clipping. It had a picture of the victim on it. I held it up to the window, where she was staring at us. My baby. All this time, she had just wanted her babies. Amelia stepped out of the RV. I was scared at first, but this day couldn't get any crazier, so I followed. "Mama?" she asked, tears in her eyes, reaching her bony hand out once again. But she didn't run. She let her touch her face as she gently rubbed her hand across her cheek. She did the same to me, but then pointed in the direction of the nearest town. Goo, she said. Go. Why, Amelia asked. Dadaha, our mother croaked. Dad. Zachary Sar. Was he still alive? After all this time? We have 2 hours until Mom and Dad Amelia cut herself off. They get back. Let's go. Although we really didn't have any idea how to get to the town, we somehow knew. Like someone was guiding us. We busted into the sheriff's office, probably looking awful. First came the questioning. Then, the DNA testing. Then, they looked for our parents. Then, they arrested my parents. Then, the news stories. And the interviews. Then, we were flown out in a plane, my first plane ever, to Portland, to meet our dad. We were quite the story. They called my parents the wretches of the woods. They thought of them as evil witches who stole us and hid us deep in the woods. I guess they were right, in a way. It was weird seeing them behind bars, serving life sentences, because after all, they raised us for nearly 14 years. But that's where they'll stay. No running, no hiding. There's nowhere to hide in a cell. He burst into tears when he saw us. We didn't. It was weird, he was my dad and all. But was he? I mean, I guess I met him when I was like a few hours old, but I just couldn't connect to him. It took a while, but we slowly got used to our new lives in a house, with a bed and our own rooms, not running from everything, or living in the woods. It was peaceful, although most of the time I ended up sneaking into Amelia's room, because after all this time I still couldn't be alone. One time I got a knock on our window. We both woke up and saw the lady in the hospital gown outside, but she looked happier, less rotten, like she was complete again. Mama, I asked. Could she stay? And I could live with the family I craved. Like she read my mind, she shook her head. I have to go. My baby, she said, reaching her hand out to us through the window as she slowly disappeared into the night. We never saw her again after that. But we always knew she was watching us. But this time, we wouldn't run. I found a box of my things in my boyfriend's closet. I never gave them to him. It started with the sweater, a simple, navy blue pullover I thought I'd lost months ago. It was folded neatly on the top shelf of my boyfriend's closet, and I only noticed it because I was hunting for a blanket while he was in the shower. I pulled it down, frowning. Hey, Nick, I called out, holding it up as he came back into the room, toweling his hair. Isn't this my sweater? I thought I lost it. Nick froze. Just for a second. Then he shrugged. Oh yeah, you left it here ages ago. I forgot to mention it. It was a reasonable explanation, but something about the way he said it didn't sit right. I didn't remember ever bringing that sweater to his place. That nagging feeling stayed with me over the next few days. It wasn't like Nick to keep secrets. We'd been dating for 2 years, and while we had our ups and downs, I trusted him. But this felt different. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I waited until Nick was out running errands, then went back to his closet. The sweater was still on the shelf, but as I scanned the other items, I noticed something odd, a plain cardboard box tucked in the corner, partially hidden by a stack of old shoes. My name was scrawled on the lid. Heart pounding. I pulled the box out and opened it. Inside was a collection of things that were unmistakably mine. A hairbrush I hadn't seen in over a year. A photo of me from high school, one I thought I'd lost when I moved out of my parents' house. A necklace my best friend gave me for my birthday. The one I thought I'd dropped somewhere in the city. My stomach churned. These weren't things I could have accidentally left behind. They were items I hadn't seen in years, things I thought were gone forever. Then I found the notebook. It was a cheap, spiral-bound journal. One I used to carry around for doodling and writing grocery lists. Flipping through the pages, my throat tightened. The handwriting wasn't mine, it was Nick's. Page after page, he'd written down details about me. Things I liked. Things I didn't. Places I went. People I talked to. The final pages were the worst. They weren't about me anymore. They were about us. Things I hadn't even told him. Arguments we never had. Future plans I'd never agreed to. And at the very end, scrawled in a frantic, looping hand, was a single sentence repeated over and over. She'll understand eventually. I didn't hear Nick come back. By the time I looked up, he was standing in the doorway. He stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. I told you to stay out of my closet, he said, his voice eerily calm. I tried to speak, to explain, but my words caught in my throat. Nick stepped closer, slowly closing the door behind him. It's okay, he said softly. Now we can finally talk. About what's next. Nick's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Now we can finally talk about what's next. What? What does that mean? My voice cracked as I spoke, trembling. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked on mine. It means you finally found it. I wasn't sure how long it would take, but here we are. I felt frozen. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get away from him. But my body refused to move. Nick, this isn't normal, I whispered, clutching the box like it could shield me. This isn't okay. He smiled then, but it wasn't the warm, familiar smile I'd known for 2 years. It was something else. Something. Cold. You don't see it yet, he said, taking a slow step closer. But you will. I've been keeping track, making sure everything is perfect. For us. For us, I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. Nick, this is insane. You've been stealing my stuff, keeping a journal about me. What is wrong with you? His smile faltered. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it vanished in an instant. You're just scared. I get it. Change is hard. But I've been preparing for this for a long time. I backed up until I hit the edge of the bed, the box still clutched to my chest, preparing for what my voice was barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and shiny. A key. He held it up, letting it glint under the light. This, he said, is for the place I've been working on. I didn't want to show you until it was ready, but... Well, you found the box sooner than I expected. It's not exactly how I planned it, but that's okay. We'll make it work. The place, I echoed, shaking my head. Nick, listen to yourself. I'm not going anywhere with you. His face darkened. You don't mean that. You're upset right now, and that's normal. But once you see it, you'll understand. You'll see why I had to do things this way. I don't want to see anything, I shouted, forcing myself to stand. I want to leave, right now. The air between us grew tense. The silence stretched painfully long. Finally, Nick sighed and tucked the key back into his pocket. You're not ready yet, he muttered, almost to himself. But that's okay. I've waited this long, I can wait a little longer. Before I could respond, he turned and walked out of the room, shutting the door behind him. Click. I heard the sound of the lock turning. Panic surged through me as I dropped the box and ran to the door. I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Nick, I screamed, pounding on the wood. Let me out. His voice came from the other side, calm and measured. You need time to think. I'll come back when you're ready to listen. Footsteps faded down the hall, leaving behind an overwhelming silence. The locked room suddenly felt suffocating. I spun around, searching for a way out. The window. It was my only option. I rushed over and yanked on it, praying it would open, but it barely budged. He'd jammed it. Somehow. My chest tightened as the weight of the situation sank in. I was trapped. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small camera, mounted in the corner of the ceiling. Its tiny red light blinked steadily. My stomach churned. He'd been watching me, probably for a long time. The blinking light seemed to mock me, and anger surged through my fear. I grabbed the closest object, a lamp from his bedside table, and hurled it at the camera. Crash. The camera's red light died, sparks flying as glass scattered. For a brief second, I felt a surge of triumph. But then, hurried footsteps echoed outside the door. He was coming back. The footsteps stopped just outside. I backed up to the far wall, clutching a book like it could protect me. My breathing was ragged. "Nick," I shouted, forcing my voice to sound stronger than I felt. "You're insane. You need help." A low chuckle seeped through the door, sending a shiver down my spine. "Oh, I'm not the one who needs help," he said softly. "You just don't see it yet. But you will." My throat tightened as the door handle jiggled. "I don't need the camera," he murmured, almost lovingly. "I've been watching you long before that. I know exactly what you'll do next." The handle stopped moving, but I could hear his breathing now. Close. Too close. And then, so softly I almost missed it, he whispered through the crack in the door. "You'll never leave me." I died for 6 minutes in 2003. Heaven isn't what we think it is. With apologies to the religious, I feel my story must be shared. In 2003, when I was 15 years old, my heart stopped for 6 minutes. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, at the point in my daily routine when I walked home from the bus stop. In the 4 blocks between the corner where I hopped off the bus and my front door, I started to feel nauseous. It came on suddenly without warning. I'd felt just fine all day. I ate a lunch of Bosco sticks and marinara sauce, something I'd eaten hundreds of times throughout high school. Before I even had an opportunity to consider alternative causes, I broke out in a cold sweat. Then, I felt the curious flutter in my chest. My heart slipped into what I later learned was an episode of ventricular fibrillation. I became breathless and collapsed. What happened next has been told to me after the fact. Apparently, I sprawled in the road, where a woman driving a hatchback nearly crushed my skull beneath her tires. Instead, she screeched to a halt, tried to rouse me, then dialed emergency services when she failed to do so. EMS arrived to discover my heart had stopped beating. I was dead, technically. They transported my body to the hospital, and somewhere along the way, they managed to shock my heart back to life. Thus began a harrowing, weeks-long journey through the American healthcare system that led eventually to an ablation, a pacemaker, and mountains of debt my family's still dealing with. But my heart's all right. And thank it is. Because what I learned that day has taught me never to thank God for anything. Because for those 6 minutes, as my lifeless body traveled across the city, accompanied by 2 paramedics working tirelessly to revive me, my soul transcended our world to visit the hereafter. During my visit, I learned things about our universe that I wish I hadn't. Perhaps, in sharing my story, I might help our species prepare for what comes after we expire. It began with light. Blinding, white, pervasive. It bathed me, calmed me. It was everything they tell you about. Beatific, welcoming, the stuff of spiritual experiences. I had the distinct feeling of ascent, like the light was lifting me skyward. I passed through several sets of gates, which my dizzied consciousness hardly registered. Upon reflection, I don't believe they were physical in any sense, and yet I recall the feeling of admittance, as if they might have prevented me from rising had they remained closed. In any event, I arrived in a place without dimension, a place beyond reality. It only made sense while I occupied it. I don't believe a corporeal being can make sense of the astral plane. Something about its intangible existence defies translation. So what I came away with were more impressions than images. I was not alone. Several life forces enclosed me upon my arrival. At first, because of my Christian upbringing, I believed them to be angels. In my incorporeal form, I made the spiritually equivalent gesture of opening my arms, anticipating their embrace. Instead, I felt myself shackled by their powers. Like a collared dog, humiliation and terror came over me. These were not the ethereal beings I'd been led to believe await us. These were cruel, unsympathetic overlords by whom I was fettered. Why? I thought, my soul wailing like a petulant child. Something like laughter returned, but it was cold, mocking. Thoughts floated into my consciousness like birds winging in and out of sight. They delivered horrifying truths about existence that I'll do my best to relay to you now. Our universe, like many others running parallel to it, contains a pittance of the total energy in existence. It is a farm, used to produce souls, which only arise in the precise conditions found in our cosmos. When you hear scientists talk about the improbability of the existence of our Goldilocks universe, it's because they don't actually come into being spontaneously. They're designed, and the hands that craft them are not benevolent gods, but rapacious beings with little care for the creatures they create. Our ultimate purpose, I learned in the custody of the spirits that shackled me, was to ripen until we were ready to serve them. On their higher plane. The Big Bang gave birth to the universe to give rise to life, to eventuate in humanity a sufficiently conscious organism that may be harvested for use as slaves on a higher plane, where time and space dissolve into an eternity we spend in servitude. 6 minutes in heaven felt like a lifetime, which I spent amusing what I perceived to be a childlike spirit with a penchant for psychologically distressing manipulation. It batted me around like a cat with a caught mouse, reveling in the pain it produced. Physical discomforts we imagine hell inflicting upon us pale in comparison to the torture of soul pain. Loss of a loved one comes closest. That piercing, emotional damage resulting from trauma. When it became clear my time had not yet expired on Earth and I was to return, I was told not to reveal their existence to the rest of my kind. My reward, they communicated to me, would be a marginally improved station among the slave population. Alternatively, if I managed to convince others of their existence, new horrors would await me when I returned. I can't imagine anything worse than what I experienced, subsumed beneath an ineffable grief and torment. For weeks, I tried to explain to anyone who would listen what I experienced. Everyone told me I'd suffered a very serious and traumatic experience for a young man, that the event left scars on my psyche as well as my heart. I gave up trying to convince them. I slowly began to convince myself that what they'd told me was true. I'd simply imagined it, a death dream, as it were. The mind reckoning with its own imminent demise, trying to make sense of the experience. Then I met someone who claimed to have met God. This was a few years later, when the author of a non-fiction book recounting their near-death experience visited my hometown. I won't reveal the author's name as I don't want to invite a lawsuit, which I'm sure he'd launch against me if he read that I'd besmirched him. I attended a reading and afterward confronted him about his tale. I looked him in the eye and asked if he really met God, something I'm sure he's dealt with hundreds of times. He smiled and nodded, assuring me that yes, God is real and is filled with love. On a lark, I decided to tell him that I knew the truth, that slavery awaits us all. A flicker in his gaze betrayed his knowledge of the fact. He really had died and visited the afterlife, but lied about it in his book. Because he knew. He knew the truth of heaven. The horrible place our souls are bound for. I know what happens when you die. I was 4 when I first saw it. I lived in a fairly safe and comfortable neighborhood. We never wanted for anything, and I was an only child. I had 2 loving parents. By all accounts, there was no real inciting incident. No trauma, no fear, no nothing that would make me hallucinate. I was, by all accounts, a gifted child who lived with great, loving parents in a large house. I remember I had come home from school, gotten a snack from the pantry, and was taking over the living room to watch Power Rangers, as was my after-school tradition. As I walked into the living room, I looked out into the backyard. At the time, my little brain could only register a furry lump. A squirrel. It hadn't been torn apart or killed by anything, just died of old age. I knew death was a thing, but I had never seen it in real life up to this point. This was the first time it occurred. From the corpse of the squirrel, I saw what looked like stringy tethers break loose from its body. Ethereal blue things, barely thicker than twine, pulling apart as I saw a ghostly, blue version of the squirrel emerge from its body. It regarded me for a moment as I watched it. Could it see me? Did the dead watch us? Then I saw it immediately scamper off. My family wasn't religious. I wasn't religious. We were Christian, sure, but we didn't exactly visit church every Sunday, nor did we avoid specific vices or espouse virtues. Still, we believed in the basics. When you die, you go to heaven if you're a good person, hell if you're a bad person. At the time, I called it heck seeing this. Well, I didn't know what to do. How was a 4-year-old supposed to handle this? Instead of watching TV, I went to my mom in the office. She was busy on a computer, having a serious talk with someone I didn't know. And are you sure it's nothing serious? If you hate Chem, I'll have to call you back. We'll pick this up soon. Sure. Goodbye. She hung up the phone, turning in her chair to look at me. Yes, Danny. Mom, there's a squirrel in the backyard. I'm sure there is, honey. Is that all you wanted to say? Mom, I think it died. Her face twisted in a look of revulsion. All right, dear, let me get Daddy to take care of it. She left the office. I could hear her calling, Jacob? Jacob, baby, need you to do something for me. She didn't get it. I mean, how could she? What was there to understand? And I didn't exactly blurt out that I saw ghosts. I was 4. What was I supposed to say? So I hid it. I locked it away in my brain, and it was my little secret. In a way, it gave me catharsis. I wasn't having existential dread at the age of 4, but the unknown still scared me. To know that your soul lives on, well, it gave me some measure of peace, even as a child. My parents weren't exactly going to think I was telling the truth either, so why bring it up? Kid me knew grown-ups couldn't see stuff kids could, but it was all right. There was no rule book, but I picked up some things as I watched. Some minor rules. Creatures had to be big enough. A mouse seemed to be the cutoff. I didn't see ants or gnats appear. From death, it took about 40 seconds for something to break free. I didn't know what would happen if you were brought back after legal death, but I assumed your soul was dragged back to you. You didn't get to fly, but you could walk through walls like a ghost most of the time. That was about all I had gathered for a few years. Things were good for those 2 years. I had my secret nobody else knew, and it gave me peace. I knew one of the great unknowns of humanity. Me, a kid. I felt like a genius. Then the greater truth was revealed. It was December 8th, at about 6:15 in the morning on a Sunday, that things went to hell. I had been dreaming peacefully when the scream woke me up. I bolted upright, almost too afraid to speak. My room was on the 2nd floor of the house, and my parents were down the hallway. If I screamed, I'd wake them up. I had nightmares before. Was that all it was? Just a bad dream and a sudden scream? When you're a child, your mind tricks you to justify things. It couldn't trick my eyes, however. Across the street from us was Jeffrey Raymond's. Mr. Raymond's was an old guy, not quite senile, but his best years were behind him. He was a kind man. I loved going to his house when we went trick-or-treating. He liked to boast he gave out full-size candy bars. That made him my favorite neighbor. I got out of my bed to see where the scream had come from, as it had been outside my window and across the street. Was Mr. Raymond's in danger? I didn't know, but I had to look. Mr. Raymond's was entirely blue, just as I had seen other dead things before, but he wasn't acting like himself. He was panicked. He was in his pajamas, howling, screaming, running through walls. He had died probably from old age, but this wasn't like the squirrels or rabbits I saw. No, he was screeching, sprinting, sometimes going through walls, sometimes hitting them. It's like his body wasn't solid enough. It scared me. I ran down the hall, heavy steps ignoring how early it was, as I entered my parents' room. I went to my dad's side of the bed. Dad, I said. Dad. Wake up. Can you wake up? He groggily groaned, leaning over to look at the alarm clock. Hey, bud. It's really early. You okay? Nightmare, he asked, sitting up from the bed. Mom wouldn't wake up, heavily sleeping. I think something bad happened to Mr. Raymond's. Why so, buddy? Just a bad feeling. Or a nightmare. No, Can you go check on him? Mr. Raymond's might be sleeping. You know he's an old guy, Dad told me. Dad, please, can you? Please. His eyes said, I'm not going to sleep until I do this. Am I? But his face said, anything for you. Sporty pushed himself up, getting his slippers on. All right. I'll go check on him. As Dad went down the stairs, I returned to my room. I'd watch from the second-story window, hearing him open and close the door. Dad waved at a passing jogger, exchanging a quick discussion before he walked across the road. All the while, Mr. Raymond's spirit continued to howl, flail, scream. I don't think it knew where it was or what was going on. Dad knocked on the door. Silence. Dad looked concerned for a moment. He knocked again. Silence. Now I think he knew something was wrong. He did a quick jog back across to our house, where I heard him in the kitchen grabbing the phone and talking to someone. I hoped to see Mr. Raymond's spirit calm down, but he'd just keep screaming, keep running throughout his rooms and through his walls. There's a danger in nature when an animal gets wounded. It calls for help. Sometimes a kind human finds it and pulls it out of a trap. Other times a fellow member of the species finds it and saves it. But most often, those cries attract a predator. And in this case, Mr. Raymond's spirit was a siren. I stayed glued to the window, watching the scene, my eyes switching between the actions in the physical world as an ambulance pulled up, and the spiritual world, where Mr. Raymond's ghost tirelessly howled and scrambled around. I wasn't sure how to help him, so I decided to go to bed. That's when I saw it. All this time, I had only seen blue spirits, human, animal, or otherwise. They'd fluctuate in tone and opacity, sure, but always blue. This was the first time I ever saw a red spirit. It scrambled on all fours, long and lanky. Its arms were too long, its legs not ending in feet, but in two sharp talons, one in the front, one in the back. I covered my mouth, watching what I think was its head bob. It had no eyes, a sort of heavy shell covering the top half of its head. It was beelining toward the screaming Mr. Raymond. Paramedics were having a polite conversation as it barged through them, phasing like a ghost. One paramedic turned around as if someone had tapped his shoulder, but he looked back to his friend. I saw a primal terror in Mr. Raymond's eyes. He knew this was a predator. He screamed, howling less like a man and more like an animal, before he charged into the house. The thing followed soon after. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. Panicked screams, guttural cries, and then silence, eerily quiet. Maybe Mr. Raymond's had got away? Maybe he went somewhere further into the afterlife. A child struggled to comprehend non-existence, and the universe was now asking a child to comprehend what came even further after. Nausea was going to overtake me before my dad went into my room, making me turn away from the window. Hey, kiddo. Hey, Mr. Raymond's. Listen, he seemed unsure of how to broach the subject, doubly so considering I somehow knew Mr. Raymond had died. It's okay, Dad, I whispered. Thought it was a nightmare, but bad dreams. I know. Hey, listen. Do you want some breakfast? Whatever you want. No, I'm not really hungry right now. But thanks, Dad. I love you lots. Love you too, buddy. B. Dad closed the door, probably wanting to give me some peace while I processed this. There were things to process, to be sure, but I didn't want to speak on it. I turned back to the window, watching to see if the red thing had gone. It hadn't. The red thing now stood in the middle of the street, hands twitching. Hands that ended in knives, not fingers. And it was staring at me without eyes. I covered my mouth in horror. Kid logic said that safety from monsters was always under the blanket. That made sense to me, so I scrambled under it as I got away from the window. Maybe it hadn't noticed. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Did it want to get me next? Did it want to kill me? The blanket covered me, head to my knees, as I hid. I didn't need to see it, I could hear it. The clicking and clacking of its knife fingers on the walls. The red glow as it moved inside my room. I was trapped under my blanket, quivering. And as it came into my room, it just sat there. Knees to its chest, right across from me. Time seemed to slow. Did I sit under the blanket for a minute? 20? 2 hours? I don't know. But it wouldn't leave, sitting there, watching me. I felt bile well in my throat. I wanted to throw up from panic and dread. Experimentally, and against the child's code of what kept you safe, I removed the blanket. The thing was easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, but its arm length had to be about 8 or more. The shell on its head was more of a carapace, fused to the top of its head like a helmet. Leathery, red skin, taut and tight, like leather stretched over muscle. The worst was the mouth. It had no lips, no jaws, no normal teeth. What instead I saw was a slowly rotating blender of a hole, sharp and jagged. It was uncanny to feel a stare with no eyes upon you. We locked gazes, or at least I think we did as I trembled in bed. I think I had peed myself, quivering, watching it observe me. It looked back, seemingly unaware of the horror I was in. We were in a stalemate until one long, bony knife finger uncurled. I watched that knife etch into the wall of my room, not damaging the physical space but doubtlessly marking my room in the spirit world. It read, "Can you see me?" I looked at the wall, then to it, then to the wall again. I nodded. Its razor maw rotated, sharp and jagged teeth spinning. "Can you hear me?" it asked. Its voice was guttural, like it came from a drain pipe clogged with muck. I nodded. Of all the words to come out of its mouth, I didn't expect what it said next. "Sorry. I didn't want to scare you." Sorry? A monster, made of knives and jagged pieces, was apologizing for scaring me. ... Can you hear me? I asked back. Yes, we stared at each other for an uncomfortable amount of time. How did you know I could see you? Your eyes. They're like a lighthouse. When you looked at me, I thought I was in a spotlight. Did you hurt him? I asked bluntly. Did you hurt Mr. Raymond's? Was that his name? It asked. Yes, I did. I'm sorry. Things are different when you cross over. But that doesn't make it right, I argued. It looked at me, seeming to finally parse that I was a child before it tilted its head. You will understand in time. What's your name? I shouldn't talk to strangers. I don't want to be a stranger. You're the only voice I've heard since crossing over. It paused, as if trying to figure out how to communicate with a child. Then what's your name? Strangers don't give out their names. I don't have a name, it responded. I looked at it. It occurred to me, in some childish capacity, that not having a name was bad. I looked it over, quivering, ignoring the panic. It might look scary, but it was being too nice, too polite. Just because someone looked horrible didn't mean they couldn't be good. Rocky, I said. Your name is Rocky, Wyatt asked, tilting its head. Rocky's the Red Ranger. You're red. So you're Rocky. What's the Red Ranger? I stared at it, realizing it probably didn't know much of anything. As an adult, looking back, I realize how idiotic it all is. The juvenile desire to help, ignoring my own safety because I felt I was special. Nothing bad ever happened to special people, spoke the childlike mind. In fact, you can help him, and he won't hurt other people. Evil was a choice, and maybe, just maybe, I could make him something good. Rocky, do you want to be my friend? I asked, oblivious in my youth to how stupid this was, only focused on how I could help him. But you have to promise that you'll be good. I would like that very much. Rocky made no promise, only that he would like that.